Okay. Okay, take two, everyone. Nekdo še prihaja. Zdravo. Nič, pa kar začnimo. En lep pozdrav, moje ime je Rok. Pomagam nekako pri skupini za izobraževanje znotraj MZPP, Mladi za podnebno pravičnost. In v skupini, vsaj zaenkrat, ne v tej poprotestni obliki, kjer nekako iščemo neko bolj daljnosežno vizijo oziroma strategijo, kako se skupaj udejstvujemo in pač realiziramo svetove, ki bi želeli. Danes smo prvič v takem formatu izvedbe, se pravi Skype intervju. In ideja je bila v bistvu, da vas, širšo javnost, vprašamo, se pravi, katere vprašanja vas najbolj zanimajo oziroma na katere bi radi slišali odgovore. Zdaj, tukaj seveda gre za tak koncept, ne, v bistvu, ko mi nimamo nekaj ogromno predznanja, pač razumljivo v bilo katerih disciplinah ali področjih, ki se ukvarjajo s podnebno in širšo okoljsko in družbeno problematiko. Torej, zmer, ko postavljamo neka vprašanja ali pa si zadamo izziv, da postavimo neko vprašanje, zmeraj odraža pač neke okvire, skozi katere sploh osmišljamo problem. In se nam je zdelo v bistvu smiselno, da od širše javnosti pa tudi mi postavimo nekaj vprašanj in preko tega pač res v bistvu gradimo na tej predstavi, ki trenutno prevladuje med nami in skupaj gradimo mogoče še boljše, še celovitejše predstave o problemu. In nam se je zdelo, da današnja gostja Julija Steinberger je mogoče v odlični poziciji, da nam ravno pri tem pomaga. Sama je profesorica ekološke ekonomike in socialne ekologije na Univerzi v Letu, hkrati pa je ena glavnih avtoric zadnjega IPCC poročila, se pravi to poročilo 1,5 stopinj, ki nakratko pomeni, da je nekako nujno, da zamejimo globalno segrevanje na 1,5 više od predindustrijske stopnje, v primerjavi s scenarijem 2 stopinj, ki pač nekako nesprejemljivo bolj katastrofičen scenarij. No, zraven pa lahko menimo, da glede na zaveze trenutne pariškega podnebnega sporazuma se nekako obeta 3 do 4 dvig temperature, tako da ja, veliko imamo dela. Upamo tudi mi s tem udejstvovanjem lahko prispevamo kaj premikom. Zdaj ne bi preveč dolgovezil, bom samo malo nakratko opredelil, kako smo si zamislili nekak dnevni red. Se pravi, čez par minut bomo poklicali Julijo. Se mi zdi, da je fajn, da ji podamo na začetku nek kontekst slovenski, se pravi, kako je izgledala v bistvu ta mobilizacija tukaj pri nas in kaj so mogoče neke posebnosti slovenskega konteksta. In se nam je zdelo, da mogoče s tem tudi malo bolj lahko usmerila svoje odgovore na naša vprašanja. Potem, no, tukaj bi pripomnil, če bi še kdo dodal nekaj mojemu orisu konteksta, naj dvigne roko, bom pozoren, če bi kdo želel še kaj pripomniti. Hkrati bi rekel, lahko povete kaj v angleščini direktno, boste imeli mikrofon, sicer pa lahko tudi v slovenščini, pa bom jaz po najboljših močeh probal tolmačiti to. Zdaj, nekako na Facebooku smo dali tisto odprto objavo za vprašanja in kar nekaj jih je prišlo notri. Tudi mi smo imeli par vprašanj in potem sva z Julijo nekako to razdelala na par tematskih sklopov in bomo šli kar praktično po vprašanjih, eno za drugim. Bo pa tudi vse skozi prilika, da vi mogoče poveste nek komentar ali vprašanje ali neka intervencija ali kakorkoli. Bi pa sem rekel, da mogoče se malo zamejimo na minuto ali dve pri naših pač teh stvarih. Pa predlagam, da kar začnemo. Hi. Let's just see. I don't think we have sound on our end. Can you hear us all right? We can't seem to hear.
You can't hear me. My microphone should be working.
The eternal problems with Skype. So we're just trying to sort out the sound on the speakers.
I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so bomo.
Is that okay?
Excellent.
Okay,
hear
is
you
that
now.
working now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. I think we can hear each other, also see each other, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's everyone.
Hi, everyone. Energy. We need more energy if we're going to be talking from through electronic measures.
Yeah. So it's a lot more sustainable, I suppose, than having you fly over.
Oh, yeah.
So we had this idea of maybe we could introduce a little bit of the context, the background of the climate justice movement in Slovenia, maybe some of the political landscape contexts that we've come across or how we view them. And then maybe we can just go through questions more or less one by one, and the public will have a chance also to respond or give comments, etc.
Sounds good.
Okay, so as far as the background goes, well, we could start with how Youth for Climate Justice really formed. This was about 2 years ago as a response to an inadequate, or so it seemed, energy plan of government. And this was kind of used later on as a platform. So a few individuals who were kind of part of that movement and also from others got together, and we had this idea, okay, we have this Greta international moment, so we should probably make use of this to try to help mobilize, help self-organize the wider public, not just youth, but it was an intergenerational question. Although we might not have done a great job in branding ourselves as Youth for Climate Justice, but anyway, we'll suppose get to the questions of the pros and cons of this. So currently, we had this big protest, right, on the 15th of, March. And after that, we had, a thorough reflection. We had essentially just 3 weeks to kind of mobilize everyone and sort of create an organizational structure ad hoc to kind of, get the word out there and have several events and so on. And then we kind of, after the protest, restructured somewhat, had a deeper reflection on what we did, what we could be doing. And currently we're focusing on a few areas, so education, field work, which is kind of like holding workshops in different cities throughout Slovenia, discussing these topics and trying to help self-organize for projects. And there's also a creative section working on art and design. There's a parliament section. Since we got invited to 2 special sessions so far from the ministry to discuss our demands, and the second was about sustainable mobility issue that's topical in Slovenia right now. And well, a coordination team has formed just a few weeks ago because we really sort of needed this moment of coming together and really polishing out the communication channels and so on so that things can run smoothly. But at the same time, we like to view ourselves as a sort of reflexive project. So we're constantly in a mode of questioning who is this we that's fighting for, and what are we fighting for? And well, this is exactly the kind of event that we try to make sense of all this, right? And see how we can move forward. So maybe just a little bit about the recent political context or the general context in Slovenia. So, well, the specific might be that while in other countries the Youth for Climate, or however they're called, Fridays for Future, well, maybe some of them would like to, exercise their agency through forms such as, parliament or the media, and they have trouble with access to such. But in the Slovenian case, we essentially got, invited into parliament right away, and media really grabbed the whole thing. But the big question is, after this big mobilizing moment, where do we go from here, right? What are these avenues that we should really be focusing on our energies on? And well, if just a bit of an outline of what's the prevalent discourse in Slovenia regarding environmental politics and so on, it's you could say quite an administrative, rational, bureaucratized system. It's sort of leaning towards a sustainable development paradigm in its weak form, but not really. It's kind of operating at buzzwords essentially, or at least that's partly my impression. Green consumerism, green growth, those are some, essentially the main ways that both the media and government and others would frame the whole socio-ecological problematique. So that's essentially what the current state might be. But we think we have a lot of things going for us here. There's a lot of varied grassroots movements, also connected to different degrees. I think a big part of where we shine is kind of critical theory, and that doesn't just include Slavoj Žižek, but a whole bunch of, So, I propose that we leave it at that for a short overview, and or maybe someone from the public has something to add to the local context. I don't see any hands, so I'll take that as a no. Yes.
Yeah, that's better. Thank you. I was sort of trying to look into my computer to see people, and I was like, I can't. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so I propose we go on to the first set of questions. So we sort of set the theme as being research-oriented questions. So the first question came from Luca, a student of sociology, and he asks if you could help us define a good or happy life within planetary boundaries.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing here is life within planetary boundaries, because I think one of the things that's becoming more and more obvious from a climate science perspective. So I'm not a climate scientist. I'm very few things. The only thing I'm formally trained in is physics, and I'm not doing physics anymore. So my levels of ignorance cover a large area. But one of the things that's coming clear from the evidence that we get from the IPCC is that, and other research, is that the planetary boundaries are bearing down on us. And there are more and more groups of scientific people who are willing to say that we are at real risk. We're at real risk from biodiversity, we're at real risk from climate impacts, we're at real risk from crop failure. So the life within planetary boundaries part is really important because it's very, people are willing to say sort of at the top UN levels, based on scientific assessments, that we are running into survival risks. We are running into zones that are unsafe for human survival. And that's, in the last sort of year, is becoming stronger and stronger. And, from the top level, Antonio Gutierrez and so on. So the planetary boundaries is also consistent with life. Now the question of, if we go beyond them, and we are in a lot of ways already, there's going to be a lot of death, and there is already quite a bit of death associated with that. So that's very depressing. But what we mean by a good life within planetary boundaries is the question was, from the start, for my research area, is how you can understand if it's possible not to have economic growth because I don't care about the economy. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. All right.
Hello? Hello?
Hey.
Hello?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
So, let's see. Hello?
Yeah. Hello. Hello. Testing. Boo.
So I couldn't see or hear you. For a while.
Is it all right now?
Now it's perfect.
Ah, okay.
So I'll just keep going. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So the idea is, can we, if we don't care about economic activity, if we care about the outcome of economic activity or the outcome of a good society, is it possible to have decent quality of life at lower levels of physical resource use? Because the problem is that resource use is correlated with environmental impacts. So when people try to say, oh, we should have fewer environmental impacts, but we're still going to consume just as much energy and materials, that doesn't really make sense, right? So the idea is really we're going to look at it from a consumption perspective, and we're going to try to understand if it's possible to live well without consuming too much. And I think there are 2 or 3 really interesting points that I'd like to raise that are helpful for answering this research question. The first is that what well-being looks like is not the same as, well, there are lots of different definitions of well-being. They come from lots of different philosophical backgrounds. I'm not personally a fan of subjective well-being or happiness. I don't find it particularly helpful. I have a sort of very pragmatic, sort of like if you were organizing a society and you wanted people to be okay, what were sort of the top 3 headlines that you should be looking for? And for me, those top 3 headlines are headline concepts, not necessarily indicators, are physical health, mental health, and what Ian Gough calls critical autonomy. And in fact, this whole theory comes from Ian Gough and Len Doyle. And the idea of critical autonomy is the kind of thing you guys are doing, is are you able to think, criticize, and change societies to improve them? So you can't have a good society, in my view, you can't have well-being if you don't have this aspect, if you're just thinking of people as like the output of your provision, they also have to be able to influence the system. So we're looking at that. If you look at that, for instance, for physical health, the level of resource requirement for physical health has something very interesting associated with it, which is that there's an aspect of sufficiency. So the more is not better. More is better at the beginning. When you have very little, more is good. And then it sort of turns over and you have you sort of reach this plateau or saturation, and there's such a thing as a certain level of resource use is sufficient. And after that, you really don't get much benefit. The other thing is that level of sufficiency changes across countries and it changes across time. So some countries have a huge amount of resource use and still bad social outcomes. So that's really interesting. And the way it changes over time is it tends to decrease. So that's really interesting as well. So we think that that's sort of a good basis for trying to think differently about what society and economy is doing, is to have a sufficiency orientation and try to understand what are the determinants of the levels. If in one country people need 30 gigajoules per year to be fine, and in another country it's 50, what is that difference? Can we learn across countries? Can we learn across societies? So that's sort of what we're looking at. And it's kind of depressing, but it's also kind of interesting, and I think it's certainly more promising than green growth orientations, which to me don't have much empirical basis in being promising. So I don't know if that answers the question of Luca. I don't know if Luca is there, if that was what they were interested in understanding or not.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's a good starting point also to maybe discuss another question that we get asked a lot in the movement, and that would be like, how do we see the connection between individual and collective change for climate, and how do we escape a kind of green consumerist perspective taking up all of this space?
Yeah, so raise your hands if you're tired of green consumerism. So green consumerism, so that's one of the reasons that I was really delighted to find this theory of Ian Gough and Len Doyle. And if you're interested, Ian Gough has written a really nice book where he lays out his more recent work called Heat, Greed, and Human Need, which is a nice title. It rhymes in lots of ways. And one of the things he does is he has this social definition of well-being, that well-being is something that is socially constructed. So it's a completely, perpendicular, different conception of what a society and an economy does, where we create well-being for each other, and we experience well-being through interaction with each other. So one of the ways he sees a failed well-being is if you can't participate socially. So that's when you know you're okay, is if you have enough education and enough stuff, etc. And how that works out in terms of green consumerism is because green consumerism is part of this alternative worldview from neoclassical economics that says that people are okay when they consume, that you express your well-being through consumption. You express your individuality, and your interaction with society is not actually social, it's through a market. And so the thing here that I think is really important to keep in mind is that we should try to have a much broader definition. When somebody wants to have a green consumer perspective, what they're doing is they're limiting their view of what a human being is. A human being is not just a consumer. They're a family member, they're a household member, they have friends, they have political activities, they have work activities, and all of these are really important and are all really important towards making a more sustainable and resilient society. And so how that plays out, so now I'm sort of forgetting your question. I think I drifted sideways from your question. So in terms of collective organizing, I think that that's really important, is moving away from that consumer-focused identity. The other thing is, in terms of what we do, all the different layers of identity that a person has, those are as many layers of action that are possible. You can have action through your workplace. You can have action through your studies. You can have action through your any kind of environment you're in. For instance, through your studies, you have access to a canteen. Is that canteen doing things a certain way? You have access. You have access to all sorts of institutional, bigger perspectives. The political aspect is probably the most important. If you can act politically, that's going to be more important. So organizing politically, organizing as you guys are doing around demonstrations, around direct action. So all of these are more important as well. These are not separate from consumption. So it's not like you have to choose one or the other. Consumption, how people choose to consume and insisting on having certain consumption choices or making certain types of consumption normal is also part of political organizing. And if you're trying to organize people to be more lower carbon or more sustainable, and you yourself are flying all over the world and have 3 houses and whatever, I'm not saying that's the case for everybody in this world, but in this room, but it's the case for Al Gore, it's the case for Leonardo DiCaprio. You know, your credibility is not going to be huge, right? You want to have some kind of integrity, and also that integrity helps you in terms of your organizing. So if you're saying, all I do is wait, I mean, and this is something that somebody I respect a lot, David Roberts, who's a journalist on climate change, and he said, oh, it's all structural, all our problems are structural, I'm not going to stop flying until we have structural change, because that's the most important thing. And it's like, well, I'm not going to have a lot of respect for you if you know something is the wrong thing to do, and you're waiting for structural change to make you not do it. It's like, oh, murder is wrong, but I'll wait for the laws to be stronger, not to go around killing people. That's not very serious. So I think the two things are not completely disconnected, but I think that there's a lot bigger realm of action than just green consumerism. And the most important thing to remind people is that they're not just consumers. That's maybe the most important piece of information we can give people, is that they have so much more agency than just being consumers in a market. Like, we can, almost every other thing you do in the world is more important than that. And I see a hand. Hello, hand. I don't see the person.
Hi, my name is Aya. I have a question. For example, hi. That example with Robert, I think you said, is kind of, it's ridiculous. But at the same time, if we stop flying, we actually stop progress. I mean, humankind had to get to that point where we are able to fly. Wouldn't it be better to find, I don't know, other types of fuels for planes to operate rather than just stop flying at all? Because it is much easier, and most people will choose the easier way.
Okay, so this is a bit of a difficult question, because it has to do with the definition of progress, which I think is not unquestionable. So the question of what progress entails. So I think that the way we're talking to each other is fantastic. That's definitely progress. I think traveling or learning about other places is a form of consumption. And I think we have to understand also the history of consumption. And it turns out that this idea of traveling and just consuming other experiences as opposed to working with people, or, you know, let's call it more tourism, and I'll put most conferences under tourism actually, as opposed to like actually doing field work or real research with people. That comes to us from the romantic British people like Byron and Shelley, who went around Europe and wrote beautiful poems about, and they were consuming landscapes and they were consuming exotic experiences like eating food that had taste. And I can understand it, you know, from coming from rainy England. But I think that we have to be a bit careful about taking predefined notions of progress. I think that learning about each other is really important, learning about other cultures, talking to other people. Like, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I would appreciate it even more if I were in the same room and could have coffee and so on. But I think we have to understand the role that also certain industries play. And flying is particularly bad because there is no low carbon alternative. Now, this is an industry, and this is a story that comes up repeatedly throughout the history of fossil fuel use. This is an industry that is massively profitable. They've somehow managed to convince governments not to tax them because they're international. So, like, that's why they're cheap, is because rail is taxed because it's mostly national. Planes are not. So you're talking about like a completely predatory business model. And they manage to implant themselves in countries where they will pay the least tax. And they have had, so they've been super profitable. They haven't had to pay any tax. Their employment conditions are usually bad. Although people like working for airlines, that's fine, but they're not usually like good employers. And they have had decades to look for low-carbon alternatives and invest, and they haven't. And so now we're actually stuck in the space where flying, there is no low-carbon fuel. Biofuels are a disaster. Indonesia has been deforested in the last 10 years because of a stupid European directive that said that palm oil was a sustainable low-carbon fuel source. So we have destroyed tropical forests. We're putting species into extinction for fuel purposes. So biofuels are not a solution. You're talking about surface areas that are too large. And the destruction of the natural world is immense, and it contributes to climate change, by the way. Probably more than just using petrol to start with, because when you deforest, you're releasing lots of carbon in the soil into the atmosphere. So biofuels are a no-go. So the airline industry is stuck, right? There's no low-carbon way to fly. Long distances. Short distances, I think they're making a bit of progress. But the problem is obviously long distances. Short distances, you can take a train, right? So they need to invest into low-carbon flight if they want low-carbon flight to be a possibility. They haven't done that. That means that, in my view, for the next couple of decades, we have a problem where we can't fly, except for emergencies. We can take the train, there's Interrail, it's not that expensive, but we can't fly. I've stopped flying since, long-distance flights since 2011. And I take the train everywhere. I'm going to take the train to Finland. It's going to take me like 2.5 days or something stupid. Anyway, each way. But yeah, this is the world we live in. I don't see a way we can fly.
Yeah. Bear with my English. I'm very tired. But bear with my English because I'm very tired and I might lose my track of thought. But if we choose, what would be an alternative to fuel in flying, for example? Do we know any alternatives?
So, well, I'm not a specialist in this. I think that you have to look for different forms of electrification and energy storage. So the problem with electrification is you have batteries that are too heavy. And hydrogen, the problem with hydrogen is it might not be too heavy. I think you could do it with hydrogen as a fuel, but hydrogen is so risky that the infrastructure to store it in the plane is too heavy. So they need to do research. Sorry, and they haven't done it. They've had decades of profits. Well, they can deal with a couple of decades of not being there. That's my personal view.
Yeah. So if I try to connect that with our second set of questions, so what's really becoming apparent that we really do need a economic paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And well, yeah, one could imagine a world where, air travel is something of a public service and deliberatively, decided upon what's a certain, carbon footprint or mileage of the average person, but also in a context of local to global solidarity, depending on the context and so on.
Yeah.
But maybe we could shift this into a discussion about to what extent what you say is IPCC as a sort of institution limited in terms of its backing of alternative economic models in its reports, because there is this feeling that there is some instance of conscious self-censorship in that regard, as a kind of strategic choice, perhaps. But at the same time, this GDP is not, a good indicator, and so on, is becoming, more and more established as something that scientists are really saying. The question would really be do you see any current limitations of how IPCC approaches, or kind of what are these disconnects between what the sciences are saying and what politics, for example the Paris Agreement, which surmounts to 3 to 4 degree rise, how do these disconnects, maybe a historical perspective, but also institutional and power and discourse perspective?
I think that those were two different questions.
Yeah.
Maybe. I think that this, in terms of the IPCC and self-censorship, I don't think that the IPCC self-censors too much. Not in the report itself. So there's sort of different things in the IPCC. There's the report, and then there's the summary for policymakers. Now, in the report, what the report is doing is summarizing the literature. And to the extent that there's censorship, I would argue that it's pre-existing the report, that it happens at the level of the research that is funded by the different funding agencies around the world. And then the problem is that the IPCC has like this much sort of research to report on for neoclassical economics and this much on degrowth. So they cite the degrowth stuff, but it's like 2 papers because there's like 2 people working on it. And then it doesn't make it to the summary for policymakers. So I don't think that there's a censorship thing. I think that there's sort of a balance of existing scholarship.
Yeah.
The censorship might happen between the report and the summary for policymakers. So the summary for policymakers is the thing that is discussed and debated by the heads of government line by line. And if they don't like what you're saying, like GDP is a terrible indicator, they're going to fight you on it. And so you have to have, you can argue for the points you want to make, but you have to argue them on the basis of very strong science. And so that's more of a contentious domain. So I think that the point is more the balance of existing research. And so you can find like degrowth mentioned on IPCC reports, but it doesn't make it to the summary for policymakers, it doesn't make it to the headline, and crucially, it's not in the integrated assessment models. So there is no degrowth SSP, which are the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are sort of like the basis of the scenarios in the IPCC that have to deal with socioeconomic issues. And for them, sustainable development is growth. Like there's a low growth scenario, but it's a disaster. And it's not even degrowth, it's just low growth. So for them, GDP is welfare in those shared socioeconomic pathways. That's one thing. And the other thing is that there's no degrowth or sufficiency-based model. Nobody has done that. And that's a problem, because if nobody does it, then they can't report on it. And it certainly doesn't fit. The models have at their basis sort of a very mainstream neoclassical economic sort of architecture of computational general equilibrium optimization, that sort of thing. So it's a bit difficult for them as well. But yeah, so that's sort of the issue in the IPCC, I would say, in terms of alternative economic ideas. Is that sort of what you were interested in?
Yeah, exactly. I might just add here that, in these scenarios and the socioeconomic pathways that you mention, like, it would be very interesting if these could go, in the more direction of, radical interpretations of sharing and circular economy and collaborative economy and things like that. But how does one really integrate that into projections of, climate impact and stuff like that when these, but at the same time, these models are co-opted by a kind of, a dominant narrative, while at the same time that we can essentially only speculate because we can't really experiment with scale with these models.
Yeah, and I think that this is where it's important. I think that working at the level of ideas is really important, which is something I was not convinced of at all, coming from physics. But the problem is that the very structure of neoclassical economics, which is equilibrium, demand, supply, smooth evolution, bears no resemblance to reality. So one of the things to do is to bring out the ideas that have to do with reality, and I think that one of the ideas has to do with well-being. Another idea has to do with protected spheres. If you want the economy to function well, a lot of things shouldn't be supply and demand. A lot of things should not be cost beneficial. Important things in the economy that are necessary for people to survive are not cost beneficial. Like food. Food is always protected in any country that wants to function. Health is always protected to some extent. Education is protected. And you really see collapse and disaster in societies where that doesn't happen. So I think there's one thing that's very promising, which is this idea of universal basic services, which energy could be a part of. And then all of a sudden you have a sufficient amount of energy, or a sufficient amount of mobility, or sufficient amount of communication that can be delivered in a low carbon way, and people are protected, and the rest of it can be ramped down. So I think that that's a really important aspect to bring, because almost no other really crucially important issue that has to do with survival has had the same burden of you need to be cost beneficial to save lives. Like, oh, well, renewable energy has to be cheaper than coal-fired electricity, otherwise we're not going to do it. Why? You never, in government, you never make a decision on that basis that's an important decision. You make it on the basis of heuristics, of like principles. You go to politicians with principles of like, we need to do this for the future of our society, not necessarily because it's cost beneficial. Yeah, so I think that fighting at those levels is really important, and bringing the argument to another level is really important. Which, and in political economic terms as well, right? That you're making political economic choices when you're choosing to frame the issue in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, maybe just a brief follow-up question. Like, we had a question entry from Isidor. He's a student of economics at the Faculty of Economics here in Ljubljana, which is somewhat quite very neoclassically oriented. There is a kind of society for economic pluralism in it, but it's quite a minority. So his question was kind of, would you have any tips on how to kind of extend the scope of their environmental thought to go beyond, for example, negative externalities and integrating it to the...
It's really tough. So I think trying to invite speakers, if they can get speakers invited that represent heterodox or political economy perspectives, being part of societies that are, I know that there's the Association for Heterodox Economics, there's also the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy. So there are various sort of groupings that are around Europe and around the world on this. So I think that being part of those, and Rethinking Economics, obviously, the Institute for New Economic Thinking. So being part of those bodies and saying, oh, I'm a representative for this international association. I'd like to bring speakers here. I'd like you to be part of reorienting your teaching in this direction. But I know it's very hard. In Manchester, so I work in Leeds, and I live in Manchester, and in Manchester, there was this I don't know if you know the story of the post-crash economics.
No.
So it was a bunch of students after the economic crisis in 2008 organized and said, you guys are not teaching us, right? Because you're teaching us the same stuff that caused the problem. And we don't want to be part of that. This is a disaster. And so we want to have post-crash economics. And they really mobilized, and they had this fantastic, vibrant organization. They were teaching themselves stuff, they were organizing speakers, they were doing all this great stuff. One of the lecturers, took them seriously and taught them a class like in the evening hours on top of his like normal teaching load. It wasn't a class with credits, and he got fired. So they're still mad, they're still organized, and they're just saying like, this isn't about, and we're 10 years later and people are not changing their thinking. I would say people like Kate Rayworth are really important, who wrote Donut Economics. I think pluralism is a good way in. So Andrew Muirman just wrote a book on pluralist economics, I think might be good. So I think bringing those people, trying to have those readings included would be really important. But I know that it's a very closed fortress, so good luck. And I'm happy to support in any way I can.
Yeah. Thanks, and these tips I think everyone here and Isidor will be thankful for. So let's maybe shift gears into kind of the activism part of what we're trying to do here. So maybe we could start with again some questions that came from the wider public. So one is regarding youth activism specifically. So this comes from Tim, he's a student. So where would you see an advantage maybe of this kind of signifier of youth and youth activism specifically, compared to other more known activist movements and actions relating to environment and climate change? What is this positioning of youth as you see it? What are the potentialities coming from it, but what are also some traps maybe, like in terms of, intergenerational solidarity and things like that?
So I think that the youth activism is probably like one of the 2 or 3 most exciting things to happen. So a lot of exciting things happened in the last year in terms of activism. I would say a lot of new things came out. I would say the youth activism, and I'm just a witness, right, is that it's not, well, one of the things that's really interesting is that we kept talking about future generations, right? So when did the Brundtland report come out on sustainable development? And I'm sorry to say that it was probably before you guys were born, I'm assuming. And it was all this nice talk about future generations. And right now, the future generations are not future anymore. And they're actually doing the role of representing their own advocacy. So I think one of the reasons that the youth movement is so powerful is because you guys you're standing for yourselves, and you're standing for your right to a decent life, and for other people to have a decent life. And that's very, very hard to argue against. And so when you see these old people who have lots of money saying, oh no, well, that's not a reasonable thing to ask for. It's like, actually, who's defining reasonable here? You know, it really makes that contrast very obvious, and also in the view of anybody who sees it. So from an external witness perspective, I think it's very powerful. And I think I think it's also been very inspiring to see how clever and strategic the youth movements are, because the other thing is you guys grew up with social media in a way that my generation didn't. Like, I was of the generation 45 years old where, like, we started to have email, right, when I was a teenager. Like, and even that was kind of like, not all teenagers had it. Whereas you guys, you've been bathing in this very sort of, in some ways, very harmful communication space, but you're very good at it. And so the youth movement that I'm seeing from students in Geneva, they're like, no parties are allowed. If you want to come, you come as a person. You're not allowed to come as a party. So they're really careful of not being co-opted, and they're really careful of sort of fake news. They know they can be trapped if they say something stupid that's not scientific. The right-wing media will be on them like a ton of bricks. So they're very careful. So I think that a lot of the youth movements have a lot of sort of cleverness that comes from being your age in this current environment and having the kind of knowledge that you have. So I think that's great. In terms of pitfalls, there are probably many. There's always a risk of corruption. There's always a risk of co-optation. There's always a risk of bad messaging. And I think that there's also a risk that, oh, well, it's old. Well, you know, we've seen millions of students take to the streets. That's old. And it's like, well, maybe it will get old, but I don't necessarily see you guys as always doing the same thing. I think there's probably a lot of creativity there. And so, for instance, the other really inspiring movement in the UK is Extinction Rebellion. They have their faults. I'm not going to say they're perfect, but they've been very creative. Like, they stop traffic, okay, but then the next day they're gluing themselves to a bank. But then the next day they're like having a concert. But then the next day they're having a skate park in the middle of London and everybody loves it. And then the right-wing people want to go on television and say, oh, this is bad for tourism during Easter weekend. And the tourists are like, we're having an absolute ball on a skate park in the middle of a bridge in London. So that didn't really work out. You know, so I think that there's a lot of also demonstrating a new world and drawing people into that new world. And I don't imagine that there's going to be a lack of imagination around that. So I don't know, that would be sort of my answer.
Thanks.
Very enthusiastic, I'm supportive. I'm also amazed to see how my colleagues have come forward and said, we will help the student strikers. We will answer questions. We will help with presentations. We'll go into schools, whatever we need to do. That's really good. That there's sort of an alliance between the scientists and the students and the youth. That's really great.
Well, I can just mention that actually next week we have a scheduled like movie viewing together, and afterwards we will have a Skype discussion with Roger from Extinction Rebellion.
Ah, fantastic.
So we'll share some experiences as well over there.
No, he's obviously been a completely formidable organizer. So
maybe next question, and kind of in relation to before. So one of kind of the pitfalls that I saw kind of coming through this labeling of youth is this picture coming off from the main narrative, or kind of how they tried to twist the story as, you know, like naive young folk, and we really support you guys, and it's great what you're doing, but at the same time, you know, we're already doing this and that, and, you know, we're preparing this report and stuff, and we're on it, youth, we're on it. So, like, kind of...
yeah, which is kind of incredible, right? Seeing that all the people who are in charge now have been, you know, and I can count myself, I'm not in charge of anything, but I've been working like the past 20 years, right? And the only thing we have is failure. Like, we have a lot of failure to look back on, and the failure is evident. I mean, maybe we would have failed worse if we hadn't been working, but I'm not really sure. Like, we're still, how can we fail worse? We're still on an exponentially increasing curve of CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
So that's failure, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious. So I think it's, and I forget the numbers. I think when I was born, we were sort of increasing by 0.5 part per million per year, maybe 1 part per million per year. The last few years, it's been 2.5. We're like going up in terms of like, you know, we're still on the increasing part of the exponential curve in terms of emissions. So anybody who says they're doing enough, they're not doing enough. That one's pretty easy. And in fact, in terms of the UK, I don't know the situation in Slovenia, but it was very easy for the youth activists to just sort of list all the failings of the government. I mean, airport expansion, motorways, you know, they had a budget where they had 30, I'm going to get it wrong, 30 large number. It's going to be million or billion, it's probably billion, right? 30 billion for roads or something crazy, for motorway expansion. It's probably, 30 billion sounds like too much now. Anyway, they have a very large number of money for motorway expansion. Nothing whatsoever was even mentioned about renewables.
Yeah.
It's just like, you're not, what do you mean? You're running in the wrong direction. So yeah, anyway, those arguments I think that that's good. I think that these criticisms are good because it makes it quite easy to come back and to keep it in the news. So that's the other thing, is use these criticisms always as a way to jump back in, get another meeting, get back in the news, have another demonstration, and just keep it going and keep the debate fresh in people's minds. I think that's really important.
Well, here maybe I could mention a little bit about the context, or the recent context here. So recently the Ministry for Infrastructure invited us to have a talk with them regarding the draft of the energy climate strategic plan, and we haven't yet given an official response, but it was sort of funny. Well, it's pretty tragic actually, but yesterday or 2 days ago, there was the results from like the Brussels kind of evaluated these drafts, right, that the governments produced, and our government's draft scored the lowest out of all EU countries. It was actually 3.2 out of 100 points. So
there's a lot of room for improvement. They should be happy for your input.
Yeah, exactly. And
let's see the positive here. Is just imagine how easy it's going to be to improve that score. No, that's pretty pathetic. I'm sorry about that. I think that here's a real risk, is that people will see, and that's something that Greta Thunberg, I think, has been fantastic at fighting against, and so is everybody else, which is that people will see like, oh, you're the magic fairy unicorn. You know, like you're the magic, like, Father Christmas or whatever, Santa Claus, who's going to come and solve everything because you're the fresh new hope. Yeah. And I think you really need to push back against that, because yes, you want to clean up the mess, but you're not going to be able to have all the tools to clean up the mess. The other thing I would caution you against, and here again, it's really important not to think not at the level of the tools you're given, like in economics, but at the level of the ideas that drive those tools. Yeah. If they ask you to come in and fix their infrastructure plan for them, they're going to probably try to do it within the framework of the existing infrastructure assessments that they have.
Exactly.
That involve cost benefit, that involve repaying, that involve certain metrics. And one of the things you really need to do is to question those frameworks to start with. Because if it's not possible to have a low carbon society, to plan for a rapidly decarbonizing society within those existing tools, those tools need to change. It's not that your plan isn't good enough, it's that the tools, you have to really question those frameworks.
Yeah.
And you have to encourage politicians to question them as well. And in the UK, we have this thing called the Green Book. And so one of the things we're doing is we're pushing back and saying that Green Book is not fit for purpose. You have to have other assessment methods. And we've actually been successful at getting these other assessment methods to be approved within the Green Book. So that's also something that we could share.
Yeah. Maybe a follow-up question, kind of relating to this, coming from another of our public entries, is from Primož. So activism can sometimes be ineffective if it doesn't, go where it really hurts. So do you have any suggestions for legal actions or any specific strategic ways in which we can address, for example, specifically the energy problematic? So what would be kind of a leverage point that we could use that's maybe a good practice somewhere, or like in terms of a legal framework, or in terms of a solid argument for alternative economy? Or
yeah, so I think that activism, there are a lot of people who like to criticize activism, which is good. You can welcome criticism. So there are a lot of people who've been criticizing Extinction Rebellion, and one of the things that the first thing they said is, "Oh, that's so depressing. You're talking about extinction. Nobody's going to want to party with you." And the next thing you know, 50,000 people showed up to party about extinction.
yeah,
So you have to be a little careful about when people say, "Oh, activism doesn't work." They're like, "Oh, Extinction Rebellion, you're just annoying people. It's so inconvenient." And of course, if they're like, "Well, climate change is going to, mass extinction is going to be pretty inconvenient, as it so happens." Like, if you want to talk about inconvenience, you can talk at that level. So you can have a counter argument. But they got climate emergency passed all over the UK. So
yeah,
so it does work. Then the question is, how do you keep it moving? Because climate emergency, of course, is cosmetic. It helps as an argument, but it doesn't help in action. So you have to keep using that as a lever. And you have to keep pointing out inconsistencies. And I think it helps to not have a single pathway of activism, but to have alignment. So if somebody decides they want to have a lawsuit around future generations or planning, or you have all the children's lawsuits, which are really effective. So the Juliana lawsuit, lawsuits in New York State and I think Colorado against fossil fuel companies. And you can look at the evidence presented in those lawsuits, and it's so impressive in terms of what the researchers were able to uncover in the actions of these companies. So it really brings information out. So even if the lawsuit is not successful, it allows that information to be public, and then you can have activism of another kind on that basis. So I think to see these legal challenges is really important. To see direct action is really important. To see communication and education is really important. Changing the curriculum is really important. So, and pushing alternative economies, all of these things are good. And even if there's a bit of disagreement within the movement, don't get too upset about that. Just you can discuss with each other what the disagreement is, but also you should be able to move together as grown-ups. I say as grown-ups, actually grown-ups are often very, very bad at it, but you should be able to sort of, link arms and move together while you're sort of discussing tactics. And so I think having a diversity of tactics is really helpful here in terms of information, in terms of keeping things in the media, that you can have a lawsuit against a fossil fuel infrastructure. You can also have direct action. You can also have education discussion in the community.
Yeah. Exactly.
You can also have divestment. That's a really important discussion to have as well. So, financial outcomes. And that's one of the things that I will send to you is a briefing that we put together for the UK Climate Change Commission and on what's possible to do with finance nationally and internationally to push money streams away from certain things and towards other things. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that about covers it for this section. So the next one coming up, and we only have 2 questions left, so we're keeping track of the time. So one would be regarding the EU level of policy making and EU politics. So, with the upcoming European elections and all that, and is all of this making the climate problematic more actual, would you say? And maybe in addition to this, are there any, again, traps to this, maybe like a sort of rise of green populism or something like that?
Yeah. So I think we're entering a world that's more polarized. This is not news to anybody, presumably. And the right-wing parties are very good, despite the fact that they pretend to be nationalist, they're actually extremely good at coordinating internationally. I wouldn't say they're as good as the other side, but they are very good at it. And so they are probably from an influence from the US, they've decided to go all out in this election specifically on climate denial. So this is now something that the right-wing parties in the EU generally have, like the far right generally have, is that they've decided all of a sudden, like they didn't care about it before for the last 2 decades, but now they're going to go full steam ahead in climate denial. In Germany, they're attacking Greta Thunberg a lot. They're calling her mentally retarded, which is wrong. So they're, and this is something that's all over Europe. It's in the UK as well. It might be in Slovenia as well. And so I think that there's this polarization. So I think that the climate topic is really important. And for whatever reason, the far right, maybe because immigration is less important right now, but maybe they see the two together, that they need an enemy, and the enemy is going to be action on climate change. And there's an ideological reason for this. So the fact that action on climate change basically requires things that they consider to be equivalents of socialism. It requires solidarity, it requires fairness and justice, it requires considerations of equity, and they see that as completely horrific to their worldview. So I think there's going to be this polarization, and I think we just have to deal with it, and we just have to, I wouldn't walk away from it. Partly because of my personality, partly because of my family experience with fascism. I'm a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. So I would fight the fascists. I would always fight the fascists.
Yeah.
If you have a choice, do it. But because a lot of people are like, oh, well, let's not take a position because we want to be politically neutral. I think we have to stand for reality, and I think we have to stand for the evidence, and I think we have to stand for solidarity. And the other thing is there's a huge generational gap here. Most of the right-wing people are super old.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing to point out, that there's polarization in lots of different dimensions. And they're standing for economic elites that are capitalizing on existing wealth structures. And I think that it's really important to remember that they're doing this because certain wealthy people see a threat to their wealth. There is no other reason for them to do it. And so I think that that's important to raise as well. But so I think climate is going to continue to be an issue, partly because for the other side, it represents an emphasis on social priorities. And I think we should embrace that. I think we should be for social priorities, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was the main question there.
Yeah.
In terms of what the EU can do, the EU can do a lot. So there are these rules, for instance, the EU is leading the way, thanks to a broad coalition of politicians, on transparency and disclosure in finance, which could change the rules of international finance. And it could really say, like, asking big funds and institutional funds like pension funds and so on to say when they're going to decarbonize their investment. You better do it within 3 years. Like, you're going to have to have a ramp, and every dollar invested has to have a carbon sign attached to it, and there has to be transparency. And that might really change things a lot. You know, it brings divestment to this whole other level. So I think the EU has a lot of power, and I think electing the right people is quite important. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have 2 questions left, and one is, so maybe I could, I can read it out, but then maybe just have my own 1 sense or 2 about it before we. Okay. So the question would be, what's the role of small countries such as Slovenia? What role can they play in the global climate justice struggle? So this question is framed specifically with regards to absolute emissions reductions, but I think we could extend this question to go well beyond that. At the same time, well, maybe just an impression about Slovenia. It's kind of geographically quite small, but it's also very diverse. And there's not a lot of people. We count about 2 million people. We have loads of greenery, loads of forests, like nature, or let's call it nature for whatever sake. It is quite a value in itself. Lots of people go hiking, etc., like close with food and so on. So, and a lot of like grassroots activities which are to one or another degree connected. We all could agree that it could be put to the next level. There's always that room, but there are some potentialities here as Slovenia as being a leading kind of experiment in how to do things differently. And just maybe your 2 cents, maybe first on the question of absolute emissions reductions, and then we could like broaden that question to encompass also that.
So this is a really interesting question, because in the UK, despite being like whatever it is, 30 times bigger, the right wing or sort of more conservative politicians are also like, oh, but we're so small, we're only like a small percentage of global emissions. Of course, historically that's not true, right? Or historically we started the Industrial Revolution. But they make this point of like, yeah, let's not worry about us because we're so tiny. So you get that argument no matter almost what your scale. Or like if it's the US, they're like, oh, but China's bigger. It's like, yeah, but you're number 2. That argument of like we can't act until other people act, you find it all the way to like the biggest emitters, pretty much. And so I think there's a huge amount that Slovenia can do in terms of implementing your own, emissions reductions plan, learning from other countries, adapting. So I know that the UK has a zero carbon plan now. Like there's a zero carbon report.
Yeah.
I participated in part of it. I don't agree with all of it, not by a long shot. But this is a really interesting thing. These plans exist now. What are you going to do that's different? What are you going to do that's more ambitious? How are you going to, use that to put pressure on your country and do experimentation around these kinds of plans? So I think that this is super interesting. And the value of example is incredible because bigger countries use examples in other smaller places to build on. Like if Slovenia manages to do something really creative in terms of cities, in terms of urban-rural connection, in terms of food, in terms of any of the topics we're talking about, in terms of rewilding and creating carbon sinks out of your forests and making sure you're doing it the right way, all of those things will be taken up if they're communicated. And you guys are really good at communicating. So you're well connected as well in terms of Europe. So I think that there's a lot you can do. In terms of your international reach, I would say that there are several things to consider. For instance, the UK might be small, which it isn't, but the city of London, the money goes everywhere, right? Like the financial sector is enormous. So your banks have investments around the world. Your pension funds have investments around the world. You need to be on top of that. That's one real way to make sure that your influence in the rest of the world is consistent with your goals.
Yeah.
So that's really important. And I think and also in terms of your trade relations and so on, that's one thing. In terms of the activist movement, I think one of the things we really need to have is solidarity. Right now there are people being killed in the Amazon. There are people being killed all over the world for standing up at the frontier of extractivism. And that's also something where you're in a relatively safe place and you can stand up for those people. You can give them visibility. You can invite them to speak virtually. You can, have that presence and hold them up. And so there's a group that's doing really good work on this, or an organization called Global Witness. So I would basically to think of who can you stand for that doesn't have the same, so you're standing and helping in solidarity with these activists across the world. And you can really make a difference of life or death in terms of the visibility of these leaders elsewhere. So that's a pretty big deal, actually.
Thanks. So I suppose we'll close with the last question before giving space for a discussion with audience. Just a heads up, prepare some questions, audience, if you'd like to continue this for a little bit longer. But regarding the last question, so if I read it out literally, it says, if you were the head of a country, for example, Slovenia, or of the UK, let's say, which measures would you push for?
Okay. So if I think I would like to be a selfish dictator, not necessarily an enlightened dictator. But I think this is also a public health thing. That's an immediate benefit. So I would immediately push for car-free cities. That's one of the first things I would do, is just try to push this idea. Yes, I know some people need cars because of low mobility. I have a father who's 98 years old. He's not going to go on a bicycle. But those are exceptions, and they need to be treated as exceptions.
Yeah.
So I think basically trying to get rid of the internal combustion engine and the private car, and getting rid of those automotive industries. So I don't know if there's automotive industry in Slovenia, but they're generally one of the most powerful political players, and you really have to watch out for them.
Yeah.
And moving that industry, and then moving towards other industries, so moving towards really super good electrified public transit and electrified bicycles and cargo bikes and those kinds of infrastructures, and making public space healthy and available for children again. I think that would make a huge difference in a visible transformation to a low-carbon future. So that would be one of the first things I would work on. I would also work on institutionalizing plant-based diets, because, again, you have a public health, immediate public health, and environmental, climate, biodiversity, deforestation benefit of moving towards localized, healthy plant-based agriculture and getting that food into schools, that food into hospitals. My parents are elderly. They get these Meals on Wheels delivered. It's super unhealthy stuff. It's full of meat, and it's like, why not change that? Maybe they would be a bit unhappy, but honestly, there's really good meat substitutes that I don't even like, because I don't like meat to start with. So I don't even like eating the veggie sausages because they're too realistic, right? So I think one can do a lot on mobility, one can do a lot on diets through government intervention and planning, and making sure that these public spaces exist. The other thing I would like to do is I would like to facilitate a different kind of welfare state that relies a lot more on popular engagement. So we have to be the welfare state for each other. One of the things you guys are learning to do, and that we're all trying to learn how to do, is to create the solidarity for good human function in the future, no matter what disasters happen. You guys will know each other. You guys are working together. And we have to translate that throughout our society so that we don't depend, if somebody's in trouble, that we have the capacity to somehow help them out. And if you go into a shopping mall, if you go as a consumer into the places that we're expected to go as public spaces, which are shopping malls, I'm sure in Slovenia as well, there is not a single thing there that can help you. You can get a self-help book, it'll tell you to think happy thoughts. But there isn't people to talk to you, there isn't people to help you figure stuff out, there's nobody to take you for a walk and talk about stuff, or come visit your house and see if they can help with something. So we have to learn how to help each other out. And that's something else I'd like to do quite more on the social side, but I think it's going to be very important. So those would be sort of my three things to start with, and then solar panels and insulation and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think in the last part that kind of also seems close to the idea of universal basic services, right?
Yeah.
And especially how can these services be sustainable or resilient by default, and how the actual form, the socioeconomic form through which these services are provided, is something that's participatorily designed in a holistic manner, right?
And these are jobs, right? That's also that's the work that's important. When they say, the jobs that count are the productive jobs, by which they mean the resource-intensive jobs, the jobs that matter are care jobs. So, we have to, if the entire society is made entirely of nurses, teachers, cooks, just people who do things for other people to live, that's fine. That's a really good society. You can be really happy with that and leave it there. You don't need this sort of very resource intensive and making things that cost a lot of emissions and materials and objects of consumption. I think we need to rethink that. And in the US, it's really drastic because the care work is so devalued that they become terrible jobs. So a teacher is a very low-paid job, a nurse is a low-paid job. These are really sort of exploitation. Instead of being valued, they're really exploited, which is also terrible.
Maybe at this point I would ask the audience if there was any more questions or comments or anything of the sort. Hands up if yes. If no, then maybe I follow up with another question. Okay, we have a...
Well, I'm very curious about, hello, about a couple of studies that I learned that they are published, and it's about emissions of methane. And those studies was from this year. There are 3 studies, I think, and they are talking about that the period 12 years, which was mentioned in the IPCC, we have to cut down by half. What do you know about that, and what is your opinion?
So I'm afraid I didn't hear the beginning of the question. I heard what you said. I didn't hear. It was too confusing with the walking until the 3 papers. So
I read that there was 3 studies, scientific studies, who are dealing with this question of methane emissions.
Yeah, I think I saw 1 or 2 of them. So methane is a tough one. So when people are talking about going to net zero, they're usually talking about going to net zero. Sorry about that. They're usually talking about going to net zero carbon emissions.
Yes, but...
and so because methane is a separate problem. So net zero carbon is because you can still have some carbon and remove it in other ways. There's no way to remove methane from the atmosphere. So with methane, we're in real trouble. And the sources of methane, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, is that they're not completely known because they're fugitive emissions. Basically, they're not like process emissions. Nobody, so they're estimated. So they come from like 3 or 4. There was a really good summary of it. But so we have to cut methane emissions, and I think that means livestock. It means rice. So if you're going to eat grains, if you're going to go vegetarian or plant-based, try to eat not rice. So that's one of my goals this year, is to make millet taste good. I don't like millet, but apparently it's a wonderful grain. So try to find, it turns out that methane, because rice, because it's grown in water, is actually a big methane emitter. Because methane is from anaerobic digestion, basically, of bacteria in cows or bacteria elsewhere in the world. And then there's fugitive emissions from natural gas. So if you can go away from natural gas, that's also a good way to cut down on methane. So the ways to cut down on methane are to go plant-based diets, except rice, and go away from natural gas. I think that those are the 2 really, really big ones.
But
it's probably not possible to go to zero methane.
Yes,
it's probably
because
relatively easy to cut it down very much if we go away from natural gas and livestock.
But my question was about the period that was estimated by the IPCC, how much time we have in order to put us as a civilization in the right path
So that I'm not as familiar with. I know that that cutting in half of emissions was half CO2 by 2030 globally.
Yes, and
So the methane, I can't answer more precisely.
There are some measures about Africa and also Alaska and Eurasia, the north part, that they're going a lot big increase of these emissions of methane now, which is part of this positive, kako se reče, povratna zanka.
You mean the feedback loops?
Yes, that.
Yeah.
And these studies said that this period, which was estimated by EPCC, now we have to cut down by half.
Yeah.
I thought
So-
that maybe you're familiar with those studies, so.
So I don't know how to answer that. I think that that's more speculative. So the problem is we don't know where the methane comes from completely, and some of it comes from natural processes outside of our control. So for instance, with melting permafrost, you get lots of methane emissions, and we might have already passed that tipping point. So, so then everything else has to be more ambitious. I would say in the context of uncertainty, we have to ramp down everything as fast as possible.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Any more questions, comments from the audience? If not, I propose we leave it at that for now, in terms of that. Well, on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of the movement.
Can I have one thought?
Of course,
Sorry,
yeah.
sorry.
No.
So and I'll say just a couple of things that I think might be
Yeah.
helpful to you in terms of
Yeah.
education, in terms of the finance issues, in terms of the right wing in the EU and stuff like that. So just a few documents I'll send to you if you want to send them around.
Yeah.
In terms of the election, do not get depressed. I mean, yeah, you can get depressed. I mean, sure. But we don't have the time to wait for the right people to be elected. So whoever is elected and whoever is in office right now, you can have meetings with them. You can go and hassle them. You can engage with them in all kinds of possible ways. And politicians are very interesting creatures because they like to please. They like to have positive feedback on their actions. They're very responsive to that. Now, Greta Thunberg, not a politician, doesn't care, just says it like it is. But politicians, they can be influenced. And so even if they're a right-wing horror person, you can insist on having meetings with them, insist on making them act the way you want, because we do not have time to have successful elections. It would be good to have successful elections. I hope there's lots of Greens elected and lots of progressive people elected in the EU next week. If they're not, insist on having meetings with them. Insist on shaming them. Engage with them. One of the things that was really shocking is that there was this hearing in the EU Parliament on ExxonMobil and their complicity, they're lying to politicians, and that they should not be allowed to go to the EU Parliament and keep lying to politicians, as they've done for decades. And one of the things that was really shocking is that there were politicians from Poland and Italy, are the two I remember, who got up to defend ExxonMobil, and they were reading talking points from a letter that ExxonMobil had sent them that morning. It was just shameful stuff, right? And those people, I bet nobody has asked them for a meeting. I bet nobody in Poland has said, hey, dude, we need to talk because that was not cool. I bet nobody has really held them to account. So I think there's a lot of power in holding even a terrible politician to account and showing them for being corrupt, for not representing the interests of their electorate, and so on. So I think that regardless of what happens, there's a really, and even if a politician is good, there's even more reason to engage with them and keep them being good. So just keep doing that stuff. It's really important. That was my last thing, is like, just in case not everybody you want gets elected.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, yeah, well, I suppose, well, thank you so much again, yeah, for agreeing to have this talk with us. I think
Thank
it
you
really,
for your time.
oh, thank you, and it really helps, I think, with yeah, developing our, conceptual maps or the directions of where we can go and the extent of what we can really do. And yeah, we'll have many of these kinds of events, hopefully in the future. Maybe you could be a returning guest someday.
Yeah. And I go to Vienna quite often, so maybe one of the next times I'm in Vienna, because I have my old institute there, so I hear it's not so far.
Yeah.
So it would be nice by train, and we'll go by train.
Awesome.
Okay.
Okay,
right.
then. Okay, Aha.
Ja, ker ni bilo čisto kontekst, oziroma nisem hotela motiti pogovora, se upravičujem, Lidija Živčič iz društva Fokus, sem hotela dve stvari izpostaviti, malo ekonomsko-propagandnega programa, kot smo temu rekli v socializmu. Volitve, ja, pejte na volitve, dajte voliti, ampak ne pri tem končati, kot je Julija rekla, potem tudi naprej nadaljujte nadzorovati, kaj izvoljena oseba dela, tudi če ni prav izvoljena, mislim, tista oseba izvoljena, ki ste jo izbrali, dejte nadlegovati. Smo v Fokusu pripravili program, pregled programov strank oziroma odgovore strank na naše vprašanja in si lahko gledate na naši spletni strani, če bi komu pomagalo se odločiti, za koga voliti. Tak, to je bil prvi del, drugi del pa Julija omenjala, da moramo graditi solidarnost z ljudmi iz drugih držav, ki so res na udaru zaradi projektov v, ne vem, pragozdu v Indoneziji in tako naprej. V Fokusu imamo neko mini kampanjico na Facebooku na prvi bojni črti, pa bi vas pozvala, da to čim širše delite, da zaveščamo tudi slovensko javnost, da so tam zunaj ljudje, ki s svojimi življenji plačujejo za to, da imamo koliko toliko čist planet. Ne? Hvala.
Hvala, Živa. Lidija, sorry. Ja, mislim, s tem načeloma zaključujemo uradni del dogodka. Zdaj zelo vabljeni, tamle smo pripravili na sosednji sobi eno manjšo pogostitev, pa pri poligonu so nam toliko stopili na roko, da tukaj smo lahko, no, ne samo do 5, kot je predvideno, ampak pač lahko potegnemo načeloma, no, ne do 10, ne, ampak kar sproščeno, malo pominglamo, malo debatiramo, kako izvesti revolucijo in tako naprej. Hvala.